South Korea's largest flag carrier, Korean Air, last week announced that it would acquire its smaller local rival, Asiana Airlines, snapping up over $1.6 billion in shares and bonds. With the takeover, Korean Air would massively boost its fleet and passenger base, rising from the world's 18th largest airline to number 10. But will it really benefit Korean Air to take on its heavily cash-strapped rival? And will having a single player in the market hurt customers? There's also the issue of whether this deal can actually go through due to internal conflicts over corporate governance in Korean Air's parent company, Hanjin Group. We address these issues today with Dr. Anup Srivastava, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary in Alberta. And we also have Dr. J.R. Reagan, CEO of Idea Explorer Global, joining us from Daejeon. It's great to see both of you again. And well, let's start with you, Dr. Srivastava. Now, Korean Air, it's currently the world's 18th largest airline in terms of fleets, and it's going to become, well, it's planning to become Asiana's biggest shareholder with a 63.9% stake if the acquisition goes through. But the question is, though, do you think it's going to be competitive as a business in the global market?
So, Seong, great to be back in your program. Thanks for inviting me back. You ask a good question. Will Korean Air be competitive after this acquisition? It's difficult to answer that question, but I can definitely say one thing. It'll be more competitive after acquisition than before. There are structural problems in this industry. It's very difficult for a full-service airline to make profits when it has sub-economic size and it is not a global player. Clearly, there are economies of scale and economies of scope. There's efficiency in route planning, aircraft fleet utilization, employees efficiency, and brand recognition. So a full-service airline that is larger in size has a higher chance of being profitable than a smaller airline. As you rightly mentioned, at least in terms of fleet size, it's likely that Korean Airlines will improve its rank from being 18th to being 10th in terms of size, which it increases the likelihood of its viability. So I can definitely say one thing, it'll be more competitive after this acquisition than it is now.
And Dr. Reagan, now Korean Air and Asiana Airlines, they were competing quite fiercely for years and years here in South Korea. So people say that this acquisition would become the deal of the century. But wouldn't it rather become the monopoly of the century? I mean, how are consumers going to be affected by this?
Yeah, Korean's antitrust regulator, the Fair Trade Commission, is probably unlikely to object to this acquisition since it's designed to stabilize the Korean aviation industry. And frankly, Korea's aviation industry would likely face collapse if the carriers did not combine because of the economics, the hard economics that have happened since COVID-19. Both airlines' financial status are endangered the longer COVID is prolonged. So it's going to become inevitable to restructure the Korean aviation market to improve its competitiveness. And that really says that, there really isn't being looked at as a monopoly per se. As a matter of fact, most countries with a population size like Korea, and I'm thinking and talking about Germany and France, for example, they only have one major full-service airline carrier as well. So it's not unusual, and frankly, it's really necessary, I think, for the aviation industry and Korean consumers.
Well, as Dr. Reagan just mentioned, authorities are really aiming to stabilize the aviation industry. Both Korean Air and Asiana have been struggling with their business models, and Korean Air having had a debt ratio of more than 1,000% as of June, and Asiana 2,000%. I mean, Dr. Srivastava, what structural challenges have full-service airlines been dealing with even before this pandemic hit?
So the structural challenges are different for airlines in different regions. So let's contrast North America with Asia Pacific region. If we look at North America, in 5 years leading up to 2019, most big airlines actually made profits. This was perhaps one of the best times to be in. Robust demand, low fuel prices, low interest rates, and contrast that to Korean Airlines. Korean Airlines incurred losses in 4 out of 5 years. So what is the reason for the difference of the performance in two regions? And the reason is that airline industry in Asia Pacific region is highly fragmented. The industry has grown too quickly, too fast. I believe the number of available seats have grown by almost 10% CAGR over the last decade. Low-cost carriers have emerged. Full-service airlines like Korean Air, which are neither the world leaders nor have low-cost structure, are struggling. We can see the same thing in India, Air India, Kingfisher, Jet Airlines. In fact, when you talk about structural problem, and Dr. Reagan talked about it, I have a bigger question with the industry. And the question is, why does every country need a national carrier? Why does even a small country like Mauritius, New Zealand, Thailand, Ethiopia, Kenya, Switzerland, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, why do they need, each one of them need their own airline? They have very small domestic markets and they are trying to compete internationally. Neither has the size to command any bargaining power with Airbus or with Boeing, and they're all struggling. Neither has any unique competitive advantage. They're all following the same Me Too business models. So I think the biggest structural problem is that this industry is too fragmented and there's a need for consolidation.
Well, you've raised some very big existential questions for full-service airlines everywhere. And well, let's continue talking about debt, though. Dr. Reagan, Korean Air's net losses, they narrowed to around 651 billion won from January to September, from 700 billion won compared to the same period last year, as it focused more on cargo delivery deals throughout the pandemic. But Asiana's net losses have deepened actually throughout the year. And well, what do you think? Why do you think the two companies did so well? Why do you think they showed such different performances? Why did Asiana fare so poorly in comparison? And do you think that Korean Air will really be able to deal with this baggage that the heavily indebted Asiana airline is going to bring?
Yeah, Korean Air is one of the largest freight carriers in the world, and it really saw that opportunity in many ways with the beginning of COVID. And despite the lack of travelers, Korean Air was able to improve their earnings thanks to an increased focus on cargo transportation. Around 30% of air cargo is transported via aircraft globally. And even though there is reduced air cargo transportation too, Korean Air was able to capitalize on that because the transportation prices went up. So it was able to improve its profits that way. It was able to react a little bit faster, I think, than Asiana, and be able to even convert some of its aircraft by taking out seats and being able to use those even more heavily for air cargo. Korean Air really expects to continue to see profits through the air cargo through the fourth quarter, which is traditionally the peak season. So I think there's the offset between Korean Air and Asiana. It still remains to be seen whether this alternate revenue stream can offset the debt that's going to be incurred through the acquisition, and that's really the big question mark.
And Dr. Shrivastava, Korean Air's parent company, Hanjin Group, is going to get over $800 million from Korea's state-run Korea Development Bank, sort of to incentivize it to acquire Asiana Airlines. But should governments really bail out? I mean, should this be done with state-funded money, though? And should governments anywhere, I suppose, bail out airlines which were really in the red before the pandemic hit? And really, when would it make sense to use taxpayers' money to help these companies in trouble?
So that's a very big question, and it goes back to even bigger question: why should each country have its own airline? Now, if you have one airline, if you have your own airline, but then you have no other option to support it, knowing fully well that will not be viable. The only reason for existence of national airlines could be social objectives, like promoting tourism, providing reliable transportation to your domestic companies, flying on non-remunerative routes, or to provide employment to your own citizens. Now, if these larger national interests dominate, then the governments have no other choice but to keep them bailing out. It's like you've caught the tiger by its tail and you can't let it go. Now, let me just say one thing, that in the case of Asiana Airlines, the situation is a little bit more complex. KDB is already the largest creditor to Asiana. It cannot let Asiana fail. but it doesn't want to throw good money after bad money. So they have created a very clever solution that kills two birds with one stone. They're infusing capital into Asiana, but also restructuring the industry. The money will first go to Hanjin Group, to Korean Airlines, and finally reach Asiana. So Korean will have a final controlling stake in Asiana and merge the two companies into one. So taxpayers' money will reach the troubled company, but will also lead to restructuring of airline industry. And that's what I mean by killing two birds with one stone. I think it's a very clever solution.
And Dr. Shrivastava, well, it does sound like a very good solution, killing two birds with one stone. But of course, there's some internal opposition within Hanjin Group towards the leadership of the current chairman, Chowon-tae, by his own elder sister, who's really challenging this takeover. And of course, she's being backed by some other stakeholders in Hanjin Group as well. And really, what is the merit of the objection raised by the private equity fund, Korea Corporate Governance Improvement, that the elder Cho sister is pushing for? And do you think it will scuttle the deal?
I think there are merits to this objection. So let's examine both sides of the picture. There is valid objection. Corporate governance requires that all shareholders must be consulted before a rights offering. No company on earth should be allowed to sell shares on a preferential basis. Now, on surface, it seems that the transaction is being done to bypass the sister, KCGI. Now, Hanjin's articles stipulate that new shares cannot be issued without shareholder approval if they're more than 30%. The whole deal has been designed to keep it just below 30%, 29.29%. So on surface, it seems like a fishy deal. But let's examine the other side also. KCGI has not provided any alternative solution. There's no alternative picture. Here's a rare opportunity to consolidate the industry in Korea, and it requires a lot of money. So the question is KCGI willing to contribute that money towards consolidation or not? So let's sort this out. One possibility is that Korean does a rights offering at the same price to all shareholders. If KCGI puts money, then the problem is solved. If it doesn't, then let KDB take the substantial stake and let the restructuring proceed. That's the need of the hour.
And of course, the deal does say that the current chairman of Korean Air will step down if he doesn't manage to get the business back in shape after the deal goes through. So, but I suppose we'll have to wait and see how the deal actually plays out. Dr. Reagan, do you think that if this deal goes through, do you think the marriage of Korean Air and Asiana Airlines will be competitive globally? I mean, beyond the pandemic, and what do you think they should really do to remain competitive?
Yeah, I think the industry consolidation is going to continue, and particularly in Korea, it's designed to increase competitiveness of both carriers in a limited travel demand. And so they're going to have to streamline routes, lower costs, and increase the chance of acquiring more takeoff and landing spots at places like Incheon and New York City. And those could lead also to joint ventures with global airlines and possibly more passenger traffic. I think that's really the hope in post-pandemic and also post-merger. The combination really will expand. I think the fleet, it's going to expand the route and capacity, and already it's bringing it into a top tier of global airlines in terms of passenger volume post-pandemic. So I think for those reasons, as well as the cargo opportunities and improvements to the profit model there, this should, post-pandemic, increase the opportunities for the Korean airline industry across the globe, and that's really the hope of this merger.
And Dr. Shrivastava, your thoughts on this? Airlines have been trying out various ways of keeping afloat throughout the pandemic, flights to nowhere or cargo, as Dr. Reagan just mentioned. What kind of changes do you think they're going to have to really make to go forward?
Well, one has to look at long-term solution. Of course, short-term solution is to fly cargo, but one has to think long-term. When an airline buys an aircraft, it is with 30 or 40 years perspective in mind. These national carriers have been around for 50 years or even for 100 years. So Now the industry is ripe for consolidation. Hundreds of players cannot exist. Airlines need to start thinking of what they need to do in next 10 or 15 years and start doing it now. Let them use COVID as an opportunity and not just as a crisis. As Winston Churchill said, never waste a good crisis. Here is a time for the dominant player in each alliance to look at smaller airlines and start acquiring them. So look at Star Alliance, Oneworld, SkyTeam. The bigger players should start looking at smaller players and selectively start assimilating them. Now, simultaneously, airlines also need to look at bigger picture. Now, let's not forget, I don't want to bring this out here, but it's a matter of time before we have Uberization of personal air taxis. Do smaller airlines have the resources or the capability to even think long term? So in sum, I believe that what needs to be done 10, 15, 20 years from now, they should start thinking now.
So really turning this crisis into an opportunity, like you just said, and very famous
Absolutely.
words from Winston Churchill is where we end our discussion today. That was Dr. Anup Srivastava from the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada, and Dr. J.R. Reagan, CEO of Idea Explorer Global, joining us from Daejeon in South Korea. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow here in South Korea. Don't miss us then. Have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.